You're listening to the #1 podcast for nonprofit leaders, getting your nonprofit fully funded. This is the Fundraising Masterminds Podcast. The story that I get back is, well, we had 50 people come to our leadership meeting and shared the gospel in this village, and 300 people got baptized. It's just like facts.
Yes.
You know?
There's no emotion
right
there.
So it's like when you read it, it's just like, okay.
You could have sent me a chart. You didn't have to do, if that's what's important to you. Yeah, you've got to stop on a person, camp on that particular person, and pull me in emotionally.
It's more effective if you told the story of a little girl who was in the village who was invited to this Jesus film presentation, and she was hesitant and not sure, and you share all the emotions that she was going through, but then she finally at the last minute decided to go ahead because she heard
the video in her own language
and describing all the emotions and the feelings from her perspective.
Using words, you paint a picture, as you said, hesitancy, some scaredness, but anticipation, and then a strong desire to find out more, and then seeing Jesus nailed to the cross and seeing just how the burden that he's carrying, and then she feels that burden and wants to have a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, tapping into all the emotional elements.
Welcome back to another episode here at Fundraising Masterminds. We are so excited that you have joined us today. We know there's a lot of podcasts you could be listening to, and we value your time. Today, we are going to be talking about 5 key elements of effective nonprofit storytelling. And joining me on today's episode is my co-host, Jim Dempsey.
Hey, Jason.
And Jim, you have over 40 years of experience working at one of the world's largest organizations, Campus Crusade for Christ, and one of the biggest elements that you've been doing for the past 40 years is working on development.
Yes.
Mostly probably sharing a lot of stories of change, a lot of stories of how money is being used. Yep. Tell me a little bit about how storytelling can be used in the area of fundraising and developing relationships in the nonprofit space.
Well, thanks, Jason. You know, one of the principles that I learned early on that I espouse is people give to people, justified by the cause. And people, in this case, generally is an individual whose life has been changed. And the only way to get to know about that person so that you can give to them is to hear their story. And storytelling is as old as time. It goes back to Scripture. Jesus used storytelling to communicate his message, and we use stories today to communicate our message. It pulls people in. A story pulls people into the narrative so that they feel like they are actually there, they're with us, they're part of that, and especially they're part of the success that's there. Think about any one of your favorite movies. It's generally because you've got a protagonist, you've got someone who that protagonist is going against insurmountable odds. They deal with that head on. They end up going head to head with a protagonist, and they end up overcoming that. And that's typically what comes with a story. And that's what our story is in development as well, too. Yeah. It's helping our audience, in this case, the protagonist in that sense, overcome the odds. And it's definitely the person who is our partner, who is the hero, who helps the protagonist accomplish this.
Yeah, and when we look back in history and we think about like who are the great missionaries of the last 200 years, I'm thinking of like George Mueller or Amy Carmichael or Mother Teresa. A lot of what we think about when we think about these people are all the amazing stories that we've heard from them.
The lives that were changed.
Like with George Mueller, I know there's the one story where, they were out of food, and then, like all of a sudden a truck broke down and and they just like, we got to give you this food because we got to get,
because it'll spoil or whatever, right?
And it's like, you hear these stories and you're just like, wow, what are the chances? Like, they didn't know that they were praying for milk, and next thing you know, a milk truck breaks down right outside the orphanage.
Sure.
So you hear these stories, And you just think, wow, it's so inspiring.
Right.
And
right.
you just think, wow, God is a God of miracles. And we love telling stories. We love sharing stories. We love consuming stories.
Right.
You know, that's probably most people after they get done with work or before work, they're reading the news or they're watching a movie or checking out a TV show and it's all or reading a book.
Right.
You know, we're just so drawn to stories.
Right.
Either telling stories. And when we hear a great story, we want to share that story with our friend, you know?
Yes.
And so I think as nonprofit leaders, so often we get sucked into this scarcity mindset,
right?
Which is, I need money,
right?
I need it now, and so it's so easy to get into this kind of like emergency mode,
right?
Where you're like surviving,
right?
And you're like, we need to do a fundraiser to raise $10,000 to do this.
Yep.
We need a fundraiser to raise $50,000 to do this,
right?
And we need you to be a part of it, and we can share like the urgency of why it's needed, and we can kind of like get people pumped up about it.
Right.
But we fail a lot of times to share the stories behind the effect of the things that we're actually doing in our ministry.
Right.
For example, I'm sure there's stuff at Crew. You know, you work with a lot of college students.
Right.
Right. At the campus ministry.
Sure.
And I'm sure you could go down that scarcity mindset of, you know, we need to raise X amount of dollars to buy X amount of Bibles so we can get them here.
Right.
Or we need to raise X amount of dollars so we can get to this message out to these people. And
right.
you can get focused on all the tasks that need to be done.
Right.
But what really draws people to give, you know, at like the campus ministry is just sharing a story of a student who had some struggles, and a campus minister came up to them and shared the gospel at the right time, and their life was impacted and changed and turned around, and how all the programs and gifts were used in the life of that college student to, you know, change their life and change the trajectory of their whole you know, world.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just so important that we don't forget the power of storytelling.
Right.
That's really what we want to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, that really brings us to our first point then, Jason. It is crafting a compelling narrative. And that generally starts with a hook. A hook is what pulls people in, whether that's a letter, whether that's a newsletter, or that's me telling you the story. We want to pull people in. You know, Susie or Mariah or Abdul was caught up in Eastern mysticism and a life of darkness until someone shared with him the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it literally changed his life. We've got to find that thing that grabs people and pulls them into the story, and it's so important that you start off properly. Once upon a time, we've got to get to a story and get to it quickly. Yeah. Crafting that narrative is one of the most critical things we can do. See, generally, we don't have a lot of time to tell a story, whether it's in a letter or even face-to-face when we're a major donor. We've got to get to the story quickly. You don't need to take a long time, but you need to get something that's going to grab people.
The way that you start the story is important. So starting it with a hook.
Right.
Then following up with the actual story.
That's right.
Like one of the worst ways to start a story is, you know, hey, in this episode of our monthly newsletter installment, we would like to tell you the story of Janice Smith.
Janice is one of our receptionists in the area in here, and Janice works hard every day, and Janice puts a lot of time reading your letters because you're important to her. You know, that I can't tell you how often I hear those kinds of things. Yeah. And as much as people care about Janice, they want to hear about a changed life. Yeah. And that's, they want to hear of someone from the audience. And, you know, yes, you and I have talked about this before. I can't tell you how many newsletters I've seen where let's unpack what Janice, the receptionist, does. And so you need to get to a story. You need to give them something that says, this is worth my time. I'm a busy person. I just opened up my mail. And why is it that it's worth me taking a few extra seconds. Because generally, a majority of the people are standing over their trash can, opening our letter, saying, in a matter of a half a second, this is either going in the trash can or I'm going to read this. And if you don't have a hook and a compelling story, boom, your letter's in that trash can. They've moved on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So you need to give them something that connects with them quickly.
Yeah. So crafting a compelling letter really boils down to three components. We got the hook, the story, and then the opportunity.
Absolutely.
And the opportunity is really
that's the opportunity that we have out there. That's looking to the future. What's the program, the project, the strategy that we want them to understand enough that they see value, that they say, you know what, I want to give to something like that. So you're looking at the story, laying the groundwork for that, because there needs to be a connection between the story that you just told and Susie or Mariah is one of 1,000 students who desperately need to hear about the gospel on college campuses today.
Your gift of $500 will
help to reach Mariah and thousands other like her.
And this leads us to the second point is once we've hooked them in and we're telling the story, it's really important that we tell an emotional story. I can't tell you how many times I have worked with people where I say, give me an update of what God is doing in your ministry. And what the story that I get back is, well, we had 50 people come to our leadership meeting and, 2 people were impacted by that. And then we shared the gospel in this village and 300 people got baptized. And, we started a soccer ministry in this village and, we started meeting with 3 guys, and it's just like facts.
Yes,
I guess that's the point that I'm trying to say. Is
there's no emotion
there.
So
it's like when you read it, it's just like, okay,
well, you could have sent me a chart. You didn't have to do if that's what's important to you. You've got to talk about. You stop on a person, camp on that particular person, and pull me in emotionally, so that I feel like I either am there with that person, or I know that person, or I know the experience that person is going through.
It's so much better to. I think I get why people use numbers and statistics, because they want to feel like their ministry is accomplishing something, and they want to show that, like, hey, we shared the gospel with a village and we had 300 people come to Christ. Well, that's a great thing, but it's more effective if you told the story of a little girl who was in the village who was invited to this Jesus film presentation, and she was hesitant and not sure, and you share all the emotions that she was going through, but then she finally at the last minute decided to go ahead because she just felt this leading to go.
She heard the video in her own language, and she never heard.
And so she was compelled to watch, and how it impacted her, and describing all the emotions and feelings from her perspective, and just zoning in on that one story, and how that Jesus film impacted her heart, and how she made the decision to follow Christ.
Using words, you paint a picture, and you really hone in on certain emotions, whether that be, as you said, hesitancy, some scaredness, but anticipation. Then all of a sudden that shifts to hope, and then a strong desire to find out more, and then seeing Jesus nailed to the cross, and seeing just how the burden that he's carrying, and then she feels that burden and wants to have a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, tapping into all the emotional elements.
Well, and we work with a lot of pregnancy centers, right? And a lot of the storytelling that we see happening in that movement is centered around an ultrasound.
Right.
Now you can be very analytical with, like, we did so many ultrasounds and so many people did this and that, or you could tell the story of a young lady,
of one person,
who wasn't. They were driving down the street and they were headed to an abortion facility, and they saw an ad for a free ultrasound, and they just thought a prompting, like, why not? And they went in and they met a very kind person who was not judgmental, and gave them a free ultrasound and showed them that, wow, they actually experienced, seeing a baby in their womb for the first time. They realized
the reality of this is a life.
This is a life. And feeling the emotion and feeling and like describing what they were thinking and what challenges they were going through and what does this imply now that I have this feeling, and sharing all those details is what makes a really compelling story. Right. And all because of an ultrasound. An ultrasound did that, and an ad on a billboard.
Exactly.
So now we can transition to how your giving is an opportunity
to help us get more ads on billboards, or to get it out on the internet, so that when women just like her are searching the internet, that they're seeing our pregnancy center at the top of the list.
But it helps you in sharing a compelling story. You're really helping the donor,
the reader, the listener,
to understand how their money is used and how it actually affects people.
And their gift, is directly proportionate to the effectiveness to a person. Also, too, I mean, there needs to be a moral to the story. I mean, we need to come down to what's the bottom line, what's the connection that's happening here. You can either end it with a very positive story that Abdul got the gospel and heard it, read it, accepted Christ, and brought the message to his friends, or you could end the story on we're hoping for the best. We presented the message, the gospel, to Abdul. He wasn't ready quite then, but we're praying, and we need you to pray with us for Abdul and his neighborhood, his community, because that's what's going to make a difference, is prayer and getting the message out to people like that. So you need to find out that moral and, of course, those action steps.
And we want to draw people into the story, and we always want to lead them to some kind of action point.
That's right.
But the third point we wanted to get into was creating a visual impact. So explain to me what we mean by this.
Well, it is so important that you really, really play into all the aspects of people's sensory. Hearing the story is important, to hear the story or read the story of Abdul. But if you can put next to that, on the response envelope, on the carrier envelope, a picture of Abdul, and again, once again, depending on security, if Abdul is coming from a closed third world country that is not open to the gospel, you might not be able to put Abdul's picture up there. Or if you did put Abdul's picture, there's something across. But there's something about not only hearing someone's story, connecting with their name, but also then seeing that visual image, that image of Abdul, that image of that water well that was created, or that truck that's needed. Those kinds of visual effects are so important. It really touches on all of our senses.
Even just the way you lay out the letter, like if you're writing an appeal letter or telling a story in a newsletter, having all the text crammed together in a block makes it harder to read. I've seen crews written some really good newsletters. I got your end of the year appeal letter, and it was actually 4 pages. It could have been 2 pages, but they did like double lines. They spaced it out, so it made it easier to read. Which those are just things that you don't naturally think of, maybe. But,
and we included visuals. Probably all through that. I approve every photo, every element that's in there, because I know having those things are so important.
Well, the fourth thing we wanted to talk about in this episode is making your audience part of the story. And before we get into that, though, if you are enjoying this episode, let us know in the comments below. We would love to hear your feedback on this. And be sure to subscribe to this episode. You can click the little subscribe button on YouTube or on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. But we have weekly podcast episodes just like this for nonprofit leaders. And we would love for you to catch all of them. When you subscribe, they show up in your feed, and you get notifications. And so you're just more likely to not miss an episode. And we really want to help you with your nonprofit fundraising and developing your nonprofit ministry. So with that in mind, let's get back into point number 4, making the audience a part of the story. So Jim, what do we mean by making the audience a part of the story?
Well, it's so important that they see themselves in that story, that they respond to that. You know, when you're watching a movie on Netflix or on television, and you might not be at the top of the mountain, Mount Everest, as someone is climbing, but you can almost feel the cold, the bitter cold biting in as someone is taking step after step after step going up that mountain. And that they are experiencing some of the same feelings that the person in the story is. And so we want to do the same thing with our written materials, with our storytelling, with our visuals. We want to pull those people in so they feel like they are actually experiencing some of the same emotions that the person is, the protagonist.
Yeah, I know for my ministry in Zambia, 99.9% of the people are not going to go to Zambia. I mean, the best thing that you could do is go to Zambia and actually experience.
Right.
Because, I mean, when you're there, I mean, so many people have told me, it's not really that bad, is it? You know, like you're just showing the worst pictures to just get me riled up.
Right.
And, you know, I've taken some people over there and they're like, no, it's really that bad. Like, it's literally everywhere.
Exactly. Right.
It's actually worse.
Right.
You know, than you actually don't show the worst pictures.
Yeah.
You know, and there's just something like when you're there and you can feel it, you can smell it, you can sense it.
Yeah.
There's just a spirit of darkness.
Right.
It really impacts you. So the best thing we can do,
the next best thing,
telling stories, is to try to teleport people as best we can to make them feel all those emotions without having to go there.
Right.
And that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes effort. You can't whip it together in 5 minutes.
Right.
You do have to think about it. And the main thing is that we want to have people identify. We want people to see themselves,
to be able to relate to them. To the character.
And as they're relating to the story, you know, they're going to see, you know, how their gift can really make an impact.
Right. The difference it's going to make. Yeah.
Yeah. I know we were at an event recently where they were raising funds to translate the Bible. And they had shared the problem that there's so many unreached people groups still. Right. And that this problem can be solved. And in this particular event, they wanted to actually reach a new people group with a full translation of the Bible. And they, in this particular event, they had 55,000 people in a stadium. Wow. Which is a lot of people. That's not, a typical event. Yes. Right. It was an unusual sized event. Right. But they presented it in such a way as like, we can actually make this happen.
So collectively,
right now.
You can make a difference, but it takes the difference of an individual as part of the collective.
They didn't just get up and say, well, this is the problem and this is how you can solve it.
Right.
They did it in a very compelling storytelling way. So what they actually did is they actually shared a video that was like a 3-minute overview of how the gospel isn't at every place. So they shared what it's like, what it feels like to be in a place where you can't read the Bible in your own language and how frustrating that feels. So there's an identifying there, right? And then they shared about how we can actually get someone to actually translate this. We have people on the ground who know the language, who can do it
in their own language.
And we actually have him here at the event right now. So we're going to bring him on stage and he's going to translate 12 verses right in front of our eyes
in their language.
Wow. And then we're actually going to send him on a plane during this conference, and he's going to go to Peru and land there, and he's going to give these people these 12 verses that we translated during this event. And we're going to see how it impacts their lives. And they literally captured this whole thing right on video. So you actually watched him get on a plane. You watched. So they put together, the conference continued. Right. And then like the next day, they showed a video of him flying to Peru, landing, and he's giving this Bible out to different people, and people are crying and they're reading things. And do you know how that impacted the giving?
Oh, God.
That? Do you think they were trying to raise $1 million to translate the Bible?
Yeah.
The first night they raised 200,000, and that was just explaining the problem.
Right.
But once they showed the story and once they showed the emotion of how people reacted,
and the impact,
they got their $1 million like within 10 minutes of showing that video.
That's powerful.
And that was that's the power of storytelling.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, that's literally what they did. They just took you through the emotion of it all,
right?
And made you feel like you were making an impact,
right?
You did this,
right? Exactly.
You know? And that's what we want to do when we're telling stories. Is we want to share the story in such a way that people feel like they're actually making a difference,
right? And the fifth and final thing is measure impact and feedback. So it is so important that you let people know what the outcome is. If you were watching a movie and 5 minutes before the protagonist, the hero of the story, was right there by a bridge that he had been through the whole entire movie, he was making his way across the country of Africa. He had finally reached that bridge where there was a ship to head back to the States, and they stopped it right there. You'd be like, well, did he get on? Did he make it? Did someone stop him? And you'd feel like you were left out.
Yeah.
And that's what our people feel like when we don't share with them what the end is. The rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, understanding what the outcome is. It is so important that we share with people what the end result is, what was going to happen with their gift.
And ironically, this is actually a big problem. You would think that this isn't happening a lot because it seems very intuitive, but I've been to a lot of fundraisers where they do a great story, they hook you in, they draw you in, you give,
right,
and then you never hear anything.
Hear another thing.
And you kind of just feel like, well, did my money get used for that? What happened? And or maybe they send a generic like, thank you, this is going to be really impactful, but you kind of want to, like, you're like, you got invited into this story, and then it's like they just leave you hanging.
Yeah.
And that's like one of the worst things you can do.
We're 3 translations short in this one particular language. Help us put it over the top. And then you never told them that, hey, your money put us over the top. Right. We reached it.
Yeah. And really, I mean, an effective storytelling is not just you telling the story of how great and wonderful you are.
Right.
And we want you to just help us be wonderful.
Right.
But
right.
You really want to invite them into the story.
Right.
So they actually become part of the story.
Together we accomplish the goal. Yeah. And for honestly, for decades, that was a problem that a lot of nonprofit and especially ministries made was give to us so we can make a difference. And we finally learned about 2 decades ago that it's so important that together we accomplish this goal, not give so we can accomplish it. But if it isn't because of you, we could never accomplish this. Without your help, we can't get it done.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that the purpose of us sharing a story is to invite the potential partner into the story, and then continuing the story after they've made the gift of how they're being a part of the story.
Right.
They are now, either a solution to a problem, or they impacted a person, but share what actually happened as a result of their giving.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of our communication plan that we talk a lot about, newsletters, phone calls and follow-up appointments face-to-face for some of our major donors, right? We want to be sharing how their giving impacted other people's stories.
Right. That's exactly right.
Ultimately creates new stories.
Yeah.
And it kind of creates this circle.
Yeah, that's right.
Where, old stories lead to new stories, which encourage more giving, which leads to new stories.
Right.
and people love to be a part of something
Yeah,
bigger than themselves.
Everybody wants to be on a winning team.
Well, Jim, this episode has been really helpful, and I'm glad we did an episode on storytelling. Just wanted to recap the 5 things. So the first thing was, number 1, to craft a compelling narrative.
Right.
Number 2, we want to connect emotionally with the readers.
Yeah.
Number 3, we wanted to create visual impact
Right.
using visuals.
Yep.
You remember number 4?
Number 4 was pulling people into the story so that they feel a part of the story.
Yep.
And number 5 was the feedback, that outcome, and giving them the results of their involvement.
Yeah. And if you want to dive a little bit deeper into this, we actually have 2 other podcast episodes. I'll put the links in the description. But episode number 19, we did a podcast entitled 3 Fundamentals of Nonprofit Marketing, where we get into the hook, story, offer concept a little bit more in depth. Mm-hmm. So if you want to dive into that a little bit more, that's really interesting.
Yep.
And then another great episode that's kind of related to this is called 10 Secrets to Crafting a Compelling Fundraising Letter. That's episode 36.
That was one of our most popular.
Yeah, that one went over really well.
Yeah.
And so if you want to look more in depth to this topic of storytelling, those would be some great episodes to check out. But if you enjoyed this episode, again, please subscribe. We would love to see you on the next one. And thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Fundraising Masterminds podcast. We'll see you next time.
Take care.